I'm Jim, and welcome to the weekly message from Hummelstown United Church of Christ, right here in Hummelstown, Pennsylvania. We're the small church with a big heart, a place where everyone is truly welcome and where all can belong. Whether this is your first time joining us or you're a familiar part of our family, we're glad you're here. To learn more about our community, visit us online at hummelstownucc.org. Now, let's open our hearts and prepare for today's message.
Someone once said, the hardest step to take is the first one. This is true for a child when he or she is learning to walk, as well as for us when we have to face the storms of life, whatever that might be, that sometimes appears too often. Today we are like the man who was standing before the pearly gates, and St. Peter asked him, "Have you ever done anything of particular merit?" And the man replied, "Well, I can think of one thing. Once I came upon a gang of high testosterone bikers who were threatening a young woman. I directed them to leave her alone, but they wouldn't listen. So I approached the largest and most heavily tattooed biker. I smacked him on the head, kicked his bike over, ripped out his nose ring, and threw it on the ground and said, 'Leave her alone now or you'll answer to me.'" St. Peter was impressed and asked, "When did this happen?" And the man replied, "Oh, a couple minutes ago." Today it's going to get personal. We're going to have to decide, like Peter, is God calling us to get out of the boat called Hummelstown United Church of Christ? Our story from Matthew is not just one about risk-taking. It's primarily a story about obedience and faith. Let's take a closer look at Peter and James and the rest of the disciples and see where you fit. The disciples were in distress, and the very person who was able to help them was approaching them. Only he wasn't in the boat, and the disciples didn't recognize him. As a matter of fact, the disciples were convinced he was a ghost. So they were terrified and cried out in fear. And we may wonder how they could have failed to know it was Jesus. Who else could be walking around in the middle of the night? But Matthew wants us to know that sometimes it takes eyes of faith to recognize when Jesus is around. Often in the middle of storms, tormented by waves of disappointment and doubt, we are no better at recognizing Jesus' presence than they were. But what was Jesus up to walking around on the lake at 3 o'clock in the morning? Do you know that there is another gospel story from Mark? And he tells us that Jesus intended to pass them by on the water. Why would Jesus want to do that? Did he decide he was going to race them? Did he want to impress them with a really neat trick? What Jesus was doing was revealing his divine presence and power. It is interesting to note that the disciples entered the boat in the first place because Jesus told them to. So they would have to learn, as we do, that obedience is no guarantee of being spared adversity. But now that the storm had their full attention, Jesus decided it was time the disciples got to know a little bit more about him. And it's like this. He reassured them, "You can trust me. You can safely place your destiny in my hand." Now put yourself in Peter's place for a moment. You have a sudden insight into what Jesus is doing. The Lord is passing by, But he's inviting you, Peter, to go on the adventure of your life. But at the same time, Peter was scared to death. What would you choose, the water or the boat? On the one hand, the water is rough, the waves are high, the wind is strong, there's a storm out there. And if you get out of the boat, there's a good chance you might sink. But if you don't get out of the boat, there's a guarantee that you will never walk on water again. So you realize that if you want to walk on water, if that's your thing, you got to get out of the boat. Now, I believe there's someone inside of all of us who tells us that there's more to life than sitting in the boat. You were made for something more than merely avoiding failure. There is something inside you that wants to walk on water, to leave the comfort of the routine existence and abandon yourself to the high adventure of following God, wherever that might lead you. So let me ask you a very important question. What's your boat? Your fear will tell you. Just ask yourself, what is it that most produces fear in me? Especially when I think of leaving it behind and stepping out in faith. Would you like to guess the name of the best-selling chair in America? And you may respond if you didn't have the answer. What's the most best-selling chair in America? Do I hear Lazy Boy over there? Lazy Boy. Okay, they didn't call it Risky Boy, Work Our Boy. They called it Lazy Boy. And we have a name for people who do this in front of a TV. What do they call them? You're sitting in front of TV most of the day. Yeah. Couch potatoes. That's right. Couch potatoes, then they're lazy boys. How many have ever done that? You're not being honest. On a personal note, do you know the first two pieces of furniture that my wife and I got when we retired? Two lazy boys. Two lazy chairs. Now, the 11 disciples could be called boat potatoes. They didn't mind watching, but they didn't want to actually do anything. I don't want to hit this one too hard, however. In our churches, including Hummelstown, there are people that could be called pew potatoes, and you might be one of those. They want some of the comfort associated with spirituality, but they don't want a risk and challenge that goes along with actually following Jesus. Jesus is still looking for people who will get out of the boat. Jesus, however, and I must say this too, Jesus is not glorifying risk-taking for its own sake. Jesus is not looking for bungee jumping, hang gliding, tornado chasing people. This is not a story about extreme sports. It's about extreme discipleship. And it's important to see that Peter did not ask for a promise. For example, he didn't say, Lord, promise me I won't sink and then I'll get out of the boat. Peter specifically asked for this command, Lord, if it is you, command me. You see, Peter didn't ask for a guarantee, just the opportunity to walk on water. The disciples who stayed in the boat did not want to risk brokenness or failure. They treasured safety over growth, and the ultimate adventure of faith was something they were content to watch along the sidelines. They didn't want to be passed by, just passed up. These disciples stand for all of us who ask not for a command, but a promise, who seek not a mission, but a guarantee that things will go well before I step out of the boat. They understand the cost of getting out of that boat, but what they were not so aware of was another price. There is a cost of staying in the boat. If I had to name in a single word the price you pay for being a boat potato, I think the word written on the price tag would probably be growth. Peter puts himself in a position to fail, but he also puts himself in a position to grow. I always ask my daughters and my wife after a good or a bad situation, what have we learned from this? And my wife is shaking her head. She knows it's coming. Did you know before Jonas Salk developed a vaccine for polio that finally worked, he tried 200 unsuccessful ones? And somebody once asked him, how did it feel to fail 200 times? But Salk replied, I never failed 200 times in my life. I was taught not to use the word failure. I just discovered 200 ways how not to vaccinate for polio. Did Peter fail? Well, I suppose he did. His faith wasn't strong enough. His doubts were stronger. He saw the wind. He took his eyes off of where they should have been, focusing on Jesus. So he sank and he failed. But here is also what I think. I think that there were 11 bigger failures sitting in that boat. They failed quietly, privately, and went unnoticed, unobserved, and uncriticized. You see, only Peter knew the shame of public failure. But only Peter knew two other things as well. Only Peter knew the glory of walking on the water. He alone knew that it was an attempt to do what he was not capable of doing on his own. That feeling of excitement, of being empowered by God to actually do it. And for a few moments, he was walking on water. It seems to me that once you walk on water, even for a few seconds, you will never forget it. And I think Peter carried that joyous moment with him to his grave. The disciples, on the other hand, couldn't experience that feeling because they didn't even get out of the boat. I believe the worst failure is not to sink in the waves, but to never get out of the boat. My friends, Jesus is still looking for people who are willing to get out of the boat. Why risk it, you ask? And I believe there are many reasons. It is the only way to experience real spiritual growth. It's the way that true faith develops. And it might be an alternative to boredom, stagnation that sometimes causes people to wither up and die and say, I'm not going to do anything. That would be challenging to me or my faith. I believe there are many good reasons to get out of the boat, but there's one that beats them all. You see, my friends, and I've learned this in my experience as pastor and teacher, the water is where Jesus is. He's not in the boat. The water, yes, may be dark, wet, and dangerous, but Jesus is not in the boat. And the main reason Peter got out of the boat is that he wanted to be where Jesus was. How about us? Do we want to be where Jesus is? I think Peter was remembering the look on Jesus' face, because I suspect that Jesus beamed to see that one of his followers could trust him that far. I think for as long as the walk lasted, that their eyes, Peter and Jesus, did not leave each other for an instant. You see, getting out of the boat was Peter's greatest gift to Jesus. And the experience of walking on water was Jesus' greatest gift to Peter. Let me close by saying this. Jesus is still looking for people who will dare to trust him. Jesus is still looking for people who will refuse to allow fear to be the final word. Jesus is still looking for people who refuse to be stopped by failure. Jesus is still passing by. What are we going to do? Today, This week will be our opportunity to answer that call. It's our chance of a lifetime to do the right thing. So, my friends, I invite you, implore you to step out of the boat. Keep your eyes on Jesus and walk on water. Amen.